talk about how things change in communities and how things can change over time. Now, this is not necessarily evolution. We're not talking about evolution, but there can be definitely lots of changes that happen in communities as we move forward in time for various reasons. So the term ecological succession is used when there's a series of more or less predictable changes that occurs in communities. So ecosystems and communities, they can change probably most likely because of some type of disturbance. Now, these disturbances can be natural, they can be man-made, but there's a disturbance that happens in an environment that either allows species to thrive or perhaps some species will die out. So the loss and addition of species will change the environment in some way. Because if you remember way back when we first started ecology, all organisms affect their environment and all organisms are affected by their environment. So if there's any loss or addition of new species or old species, that the environment will change. So this term, ecological succession, let's talk a little bit more about that. So we have two types of succession that we see in communities over time. We see primary and secondary succession. Let's focus a little bit on primary succession first. So primary succession is a type of succession that begins in an area where there's no remnants of an older community or soil. It's starting off from scratch. So this happens perhaps when a disturbance wipes everything out. An example is a volcanic eruption. When that happens, it burns everything. There is typically nothing left. No soil, no organisms, nothing. So what happens is it usually takes a very long time for primary succession to take hold, but we start to see pioneer species. And these pioneer species are the first species to colonize a barren area. This particular picture, it's it's a very general picture, but what we start to see is some of those organisms that will create soil. We'll start to see some bacteria. We'll start to then see lichens, mosses. So we'll start to see some things come back that are small, sometimes microscopic, but those pioneer species will start to come in. The second type of succession that we would see is secondary succession. Now, this is a type of succession that occurs where there's something that remains from the community after a disturbance. So a lot of times an example could be a hurricane or a wildfire. These types of disturbances don't wipe out everything. So there's something that's already there. So pioneer species do not occur in a secondary succession. This type of succession, secondary succession, happens much faster because the soil is already there. So typically the soil is going to survive. And I have the survive in air quotes and quotes on the screen as well, because the soil is there. Now, another major difference between these two is that it does not happen in order. So please don't think of primary succession happening before secondary succession. It does not happen in order. It just is the name of it. So primary succession takes a very long time to happen, happens because there's nothing left over from the previous community. And secondary succession typically occurs much faster because the soil is already there. The disturbance did not wipe out that particular soil. So take a look at this, and again, we'll be doing more of this in class. So not just communities can change over time, but ecosystems can as well. So remember, back to the previous video, we took a look back at those two terms, community and ecosystems and biosphere. Do understand that the ecosystem itself is that another level of organization, so it's much broader. So biodiversity in an ecosystem can change for other reasons, such as seasonal climate change. So the climate is the pattern of temperature and precipitation data that's collected over a 30-year period. It's not your weather, so we look outside and we see, oh, it might be raining, or oh, today's really hot. Climate is really all this data over 30 years, so it's a span of data. So seasonal climate change can happen because of the rotation, revolution, or the tilt of the Earth. So we have different seasons. It might be winter time, it might be summertime. That's definitely going to change the biodiversity in an ecosystem. A lot of times birds do migrate. Some types of other organisms might go into hibernation. So seasonal climate change has a definite factor in order to change an ecosystem over time. Now, this again, it's seasonal, so it could change within the year. Other types of changes over time in an ecosystem that we could see are human created impacts. Now, we see some of this already today, where we might see the destruction of habitats, where entire forests or rainforests or areas are destroyed because of our need for shelter. We need places to live, or we need places for um, agriculture. So, a lot of times these are human created impacts. Pollution is another human created impact. This could include pesticides or acid rain formation over time. An out of control greenhouse effect, which we are starting to see now as well. We're starting to see the globe warming up a little bit, which is very nerve wracking. And it's a possibility that this is already killing and making some organisms extinct. A third change in ecosystems could be the introduction of invasive or non-native species. And we see this a lot too in areas, and the lionfish here in Florida is actually an invasive species. And if you've ever seen a lionfish or not, it's beautiful. Here's a picture of a lionfish. So lionfish are gorgeous little animals, and they are named lionfish due to their fins out here that look like manes of a lion. So the lionfish is an invasive species here in Florida. It's native to, I believe, Asia and the waters in Asia, but somehow it got here, and there is no normal natural predator for this particular fish. So what it's doing is it is reproducing extremely fast, and it is taking over and eating a lot of the different things in the food chain that might belong to something else, or the food webs. So, in other words, it's starting to hurt the environment a lot. Another invasive species that we see out west is something called the jackalope. So the jackalope is a little bit rabbit and a little bit antelope. So it's a jackalope. So if you'd like to go ahead and research a little bit about the jackalope, please go ahead and do so. Now, there's a lot of consequences to losing biodiversity. So remember, biodiversity is the genetic makeup of all the organisms in an ecosystem. So we really like to see a lot of biodiversity. It's very healthy for ecosystems, and it's very beneficial to organisms, including humans. So biodiversity is important to the biosphere because remember, and I've said it again, as I've said all along, all organisms affect their environment as all organisms are affected. So once we start to kind of destroy some of this biodiversity, then we're starting to hurt the other organisms that are affected by those organisms. There's a lot of interconnectedness here. So remember, a lot of the biodiversity we see provides contributions to medicine, agriculture, maintaining proper soil and water quality and air quality for us. So we start cutting this out of our ecosystems, some of this biodiversity. It really is causing a lot of issues. So there's a lot of consequences to this, and perhaps we don't know all of these consequences. So where would humanity be without the biodiversity of our planet? Um, that's to be seen, really. We really don't know, but because they do, biodiversity provides tons of contributions to everything that we use and we need and depend on. It's quite possible that the human race might be affected very negatively from this.